They called him a god, but he behaved like a beast. Once, Tiberius Claudius Nero was the pride of Rome, a soldier of discipline, a statesman of restraint, the man chosen to inherit the golden legacy of Augustus himself. Under his command, legions marched with precision, borders expanded, and the empire's enemies trembled before the shadow of his eagles. He was Rome's second emperor, the living symbol of order, reason, and power. But power has a way of rotting even the strongest hearts. The same man who once fought to protect Rome from chaos would one day become its greatest nightmare. Behind the marble statues and imperial laurels, something began to decay. Quietly, invisibly. Tiberius withdrew from the public eye, retreating from the Senate, from the people, even from his own blood. The emperor who ruled the world could no longer rule himself. They said his eyes changed, once clear as steel, now heavy with suspicion. Every whisper became a conspiracy, every face a mask hiding betrayal. He no longer saw citizens or servants, only potential enemies. So he left Rome and fled to the sea. Far from the noise of the capital, on the cliffs of Capri, Tiberius built his paradise. But paradise, when ruled by fear and solitude, becomes something else, a prison gilded in sunlight, a sanctuary for madness. There, surrounded by luxury and silence, the emperor's mind began to unravel. The line between desire and delusion blurred until he could no longer tell the difference. The man who once led armies to victory now ruled over shadows. The general became a recluse, the emperor, a tyrant of flesh. The sea below his villa crashed endlessly against the rocks, as if Rome itself begged to be freed from the weight of his sins. History remembers his reign not for its triumphs but for its horrors. Because when a man who commands legions decides that the human body is his empire, what limits remain? When Tiberius left Rome, the city exhaled as if a storm had finally passed. But it was not peace that followed, only a silence heavy with dread. He had ruled the world from marble halls, yet in the twilight of his reign, he abandoned it all for an island adrift in the blue of the Tyrrhenian Sea, Capri, a paradise of cliffs and grottos, kissed by sun and salt. To the Romans, it seemed a retreat. To Tiberius, it was escape. From enemies, from politics, from himself. Atop the island's highest peak, he built Villa Jovis, the Villa of Jupiter. It was less a home and more a fortress, perched like a watchtower over the endless sea. From there, he could gaze across the horizon toward a Rome he no longer trusted. Every window opened to light, but inside, the chambers were shadowed, cold, and silent. Servants moved like ghosts, careful never to meet the emperor's eye, for they knew that one wrong glance could end a life. Tiberius feared what he could not control. He believed daggers hid behind every smile in Rome, senators, generals, even his own kin. The memory of his stepson, Germanicus, beloved by the people and dead under mysterious circumstances, haunted him. Was it murder? Poison? Conspiracy? The whispers reached him even here, carried across the waves. He trusted no one. In the beginning, his retreat seemed like the act of a weary old man seeking peace. But peace demands the company of the soul, and Tiberius had already lost his. The solitude that surrounded him did not soothe, it suffocated. He would spend days pacing the marble corridors of his villa, eyes tracing the cracks in the floor as if they might spell out some hidden betrayal. He drank heavily, spoke rarely, and watched the sea as though waiting for an answer that never came. The isolation began to warp him. The emperor who once commanded legions now commanded only servants, and even they trembled at his voice. Every message from Rome filled him with suspicion. Every courier was interrogated, sometimes executed. The more he withdrew from the world, the larger his fears grew inside him. He began to see plots where there were none, ghosts in the corridors, voices in the wind that hissed his name. But fear, when given power, mutates. It becomes cruelty. In his loneliness, Tiberius discovered a dark comfort in control, not over provinces or armies, but over people. The emperor who once wielded law now wielded secrecy and pleasure as weapons. He began to summon those who pleased him to Capri, under the guise of service, loyalty, or beauty. To the outside world, these were gifts from the emperor. To those who arrived, they were chains. The island soon filled with the young, the vulnerable, the desperate. Tiberius shaped them into instruments of obedience, not companions but reflections of his will. Behind the villa's walls, he could dictate every gesture, every word, every breath. Here, far from Rome's judgment, he was not merely emperor, he was God. Yet even gods need witnesses. The servants and guards of Capri carried tales back to the mainland, stories so strange, so vile, that even Rome's hardened hearts recoiled. They whispered of what the emperor did in the night, of what his gardens had become. The Senate dared not speak his name aloud, but in the taverns and forums, people began to call him Caprineus, the goat of Capri. It was a word born of both mockery and fear. Still, no one dared confront him. His letters continued to arrive in Rome, written in his cold, precise hand, orders of executions, confiscations, decrees. The Senate bowed, pretending loyalty, even as their hatred festered. For how do you rebel against a man who rules from the edge of the world, invisible yet omnipotent? Each passing year, Tiberius drifted further from humanity. The emperor who had once commanded the legions now commanded shadows. The island became an echo chamber of his madness, every scream or sob swallowed by the sea. The sound of the waves against the cliffs became his only audience, steady, eternal, unforgiving. He watched the horizon as if daring Rome to come for him, but no one did. Perhaps they hoped the island would finish what assassins could not. That isolation would devour the tyrant more effectively than steel. And in a way it did, because on Capri, Tiberius did not rule the world anymore. He ruled only his fears, his appetites, and the ghosts of his past. The man who had conquered nations was now conquered by the silence he had chosen. And so, in the shadow of the gods, the emperor began to unmake himself. The island of Capri glittered like a jewel in the sunlight, but beneath that brilliance it hid rot. Villa Jovis, Tiberius's marble fortress, became the heart of something that no historian could fully describe without trembling. To the world, it remained a place of retreat. To those who lived within its walls, it was something else entirely, a realm ruled by silence, fear, and the emperor's hunger for absolute control. Tiberius filled his villa not with senators or scholars, but with youths and slaves, chosen for their beauty, their obedience, their silence. They came from every corner of the empire, Greek, Syrian, Egyptian, brought across the sea like offerings to a god who had forgotten mercy. They were trained not to think, only to please. Each gesture rehearsed, each word measured. The emperor demanded purity, yet he destroyed it in the very act of possession. To serve him was to surrender everything, name, will, identity. He called them his companions, but they were shadows, living ornaments in a palace of ghosts. Their laughter was hollow, their smiles rehearsed. The villa's halls echoed with a strange stillness, as if the sea itself held its breath. Outside, the island's cliffs rose like the teeth of some ancient beast, and below them, the waves swallowed whatever displeased the emperor. Roman historians, centuries later, struggled to capture what truly happened there. Suetonius wrote of horrors so obscene that even Rome's decadent imagination strained to believe them. Tacitus, always measured, spoke of abominations whispered by slaves and sailors. They both admitted that rumor blurred with reality, but perhaps that was the point. The stories of Capri were meant to terrify, to remind Rome of what happens when power slips its leash. In the villa's courtyards, statues of gods stood cracked and weathered, their marble eyes staring down upon new rituals that mocked their sanctity. What once had been temples to Jupiter and Venus now became theaters of human degradation. Servants were taught that to displease the emperor was death, but to please him was often worse. Tiberius's cruelty was not impulsive. It was calculated. He understood the mechanics of fear. He broke his subjects in stages, first by isolation, then by reward, then by confusion. He would smile upon one and condemn another without cause, teaching all that safety was an illusion. Each day began in dread and ended in relief that one still lived. In that state of constant terror, even the smallest gesture of mercy seemed divine. It was not pleasure that drove him. It was the joy of absolute power, of knowing that no God, no law, no conscience could touch him. To the Romans, love had always been a game of dominance, but Tiberius twisted it into something darker. He no longer sought affection or beauty, he sought submission. To him, love was not a bond but a form of conquest, another battlefield where he alone could triumph. Those who entered his favor did so at the cost of their souls. Those who resisted vanished, cast into the sea or buried in unmarked graves along the cliffs. The emperor's madness began to infect the island itself. Gardens once filled with olive trees and flowers were remade into strange sanctuaries, where music played with no joy and laughter carried a note of pain. Night after night, torches flickered against the marble walls, casting monstrous shapes that seemed to dance on their own. The air was thick with perfume and dread. Servants whispered that the villa was cursed, that Jupiter had turned his face away. And yet, outside that prison of luxury, the world still called him emperor. Capri became his miniature Rome, a reflection of the empire's own corruption, every face smiling in public, every heart terrified in private. The island became a stage for living nightmares, a laboratory where Tiberius experimented with the limits of obedience and the endurance of the human spirit. Word of his behavior trickled back to the mainland like poison seeping through water. Merchants, sailors, and exiles carried stories of the emperor's perversions, stories that multiplied with every retelling. Some said he dined beside fountains of wine and blood, others that he performed rituals too unspeakable to name. The truth was likely tangled among the lies, yet what mattered was not accuracy, but fear. Rome no longer saw Tiberius as man or emperor. He was a symbol of power corrupted, a reminder that even civilization's brightest empire could harbor monsters at its core. The Senate remained silent. To question the emperor's behavior was to court death, and so they praised him in decrees and letters, calling him divine and father of the nation. Behind closed doors, they prayed for his death. But Capri was far away, unreachable, guarded by soldiers whose loyalty was purchased with terror. No assassin could reach him there. As the years passed, Tiberius's isolation deepened. His attendants noticed how rarely he looked at the sea anymore. Once he had found beauty in its endlessness, now it only reflected his emptiness. The waves below Villa Jovis were said to swallow more than bodies. They swallowed confessions, cries, and truth itself. Historians still argue whether the tales of Capri were exaggerations born from hatred or fragments of a reality too dark to record. Perhaps Suetonius embroidered them to thrill and disgust his readers. Perhaps the truth was even worse than rumor dared admit. But in either case, the stories served their purpose. They painted Tiberius as something more than human and less than sane. An emperor who ruled not through love or law, but through the pure gravity of fear. In the end, it no longer mattered what was fact or fiction. On Capri, truth itself had become fluid, bending to the will of one man. The island that had promised escape had become a mirror of his soul, beautiful, unyielding, and rotten beneath the surface. And so, the world's most powerful ruler drifted ever deeper into the abyss of his own making. He believed himself untouchable, eternal, godlike. Yet every god the Romans ever worshipped demanded sacrifice, and Tiberius, in his madness, made his sacrifices of flesh and spirit alike. Was he mad, or simply free of consequence? Historians still wonder, but to those who lived and died beneath his shadow, there was no difference. Because on Capri, divinity and depravity had become one and the same. Power, when left unchecked, begins to eat the soul. For Tiberius, it devoured everything that once tethered him to humanity. On Capri, surrounded by luxury, silence, and fear, the emperor discovered that there were no limits left to test, except those within himself. The man who had once ruled by discipline now ruled by desire, but not desire for beauty, nor for comfort. His was the desire to dominate, to break what was pure simply because he could. Shame, once the boundary between man and beast, had long since died in him. What replaced it was something colder: curiosity. a hunger to see how far a man might fall before the gods themselves turned away. The feasts at Villa Jovis became grotesque performances of his power. Beneath ceilings painted with constellations, the emperor dined not in joy, but in spectacle. He sat surrounded by trembling attendants, his table heavy with gold and silver, every platter a monument to excess. Yet there was no laughter, no celebration. Those who served him did so with shaking hands, praying their gestures would not displease. For in Tiberius's court, pleasure was never shared, it was extracted. He turned the human body into an instrument of humiliation. What had once been the language of love became for him a form of punishment. He twisted gestures of tenderness into displays of control, forcing those around him to act out his fantasies of power and submission. It was not lust, it was proof. Proof that he could bend creation itself to his will. Proof that no law, divine or mortal, could restrain him. Every day on Capri blurred into the next. The emperor's eyes grew duller, his words fewer. The faces around him changed constantly. None lasted long. Servants disappeared in the night, their names erased from records, their bodies swallowed by the sea below the cliffs. It was said that the waves beneath Villa Jovis were tinted red at dawn, though no one dared speak of why. His paranoia deepened. He began to see betrayal everywhere. The smallest glance, a whispered conversation, even a servant's hesitation at his command, all became signs of treachery. He ordered executions for imagined crimes, often carried out before his eyes. Senators summoned to Capri never returned. Some took their own lives rather than face the emperor's summons. The island that had once been his refuge was now a stage of terror. Soldiers patrolled the cliffs, guarding not against invaders, but against escape. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow too loudly, lest it carry secrets back to Rome. Tiberius's mind, already unsteady, began to unravel in full. He stopped trusting his advisors, his guards, his family. Letters from the mainland arrived sealed with wax, but he tore them open with suspicion, convinced that each message carried poison in its words. He issued decrees drenched in paranoia, confiscations, arrests, accusations of treason that required no proof. Rome obeyed in silence. The Senate, emasculated by fear, praised him as a god while privately cursing his name. Every edict from Capri was followed by blood. The empire's machinery of law became an instrument of vengeance. In those years, Capri ceased to be a place of life. The courtyards that once smelled of myrrh and olive oil now reeked of incense burned to hide darker scents. The marble walls, once radiant, seemed to absorb the suffering within them, growing heavy with unseen stains. The laughter of youths, once imported to amuse, now echoed hollowly through corridors where joy had long been exiled. Tiberius no longer sought companionship. He surrounded himself with flatterers and spies, men too frightened to speak truth. He would sit for hours by the window overlooking the sea, staring into the horizon with eyes that saw nothing. The waves' eternal motion seemed to mock him, untamed, unbroken, beyond his control. Perhaps that was why he grew to hate them. He built new chambers within Villa Jovis, secret rooms hidden behind veils and doors without handles. There, his rituals unfolded, rituals whispered about by sailors and chroniclers but never truly witnessed. The details, passed down through rumor and disgust, were less about the acts themselves than the intent behind them. They said the emperor had replaced morality with theater, that every cruelty he devised was a sermon on his own divinity. He did not crave pleasure. He craved proof that he could twist creation itself. To Tiberius, the world had become a mirror. Every person was merely a reflection of his power, every act a demonstration of his godhood, but the more he indulged, the further that mirror cracked. Reality began to slip through the fractures. Sometimes in the late hours of the night, witnesses claimed he would speak to empty rooms, calling out names of the dead, his wife, his son, his lost generals. He accused them of betrayal, cursed them, begged them for forgiveness, all within the same breath. The emperor who had conquered the world now waged war against ghosts of his own making. His villa became both a brothel and a graveyard of innocence. Bodies came and went, nameless and forgotten, their suffering buried beneath the marble floors. The emperor who had once demanded discipline from his soldiers now demanded submission from those too weak to resist. The boundaries between cruelty and ritual disappeared. Capri had become his personal underworld, and he its unwilling god. The historians who later wrote of these years disagreed on the truth of it all. Some believed that the rumors were inventions of a hateful Senate. Others swore they understated the reality. But truth mattered little. The stories of Capri were not history, they were prophecy. They told of what happens when a man climbs too high until the air itself becomes poison. And yet, Tiberius endured. Even as madness gnawed at him, even as Rome's people whispered of monsters and gods, the emperor lived on, untouched, unpunished. His power was absolute, his crimes untold. There are moments in history when morality ceases to exist, not because it is forgotten, but because it becomes irrelevant. For Tiberius, shame had died long before his body ever would. On the cliffs of Capri, beneath a sky too blue to witness the horror below, he sat in the golden light of his own decay. The empire's ruler, stripped of reason, stripped of restraint, surrounded by the echoes of what he had destroyed. And in that silence, the world's most powerful man became something less than human and far more terrifying. In Rome, the air itself seemed to change. It grew heavier, quieter, charged with a fear that no one dared name. The emperor had been gone for years, hidden away on his island of marble and mist, yet his shadow still stretched across the empire. Capri was far away, but its darkness seeped through every letter, every decree, every whisper that escaped its walls. The city that once roared with debate now spoke only in murmurs. Senators entered the curia like men entering a tomb, each unsure if he would leave it alive. They praised Tiberius in public, called him father of the nation, son of Augustus, protector of Rome, but in private their words were venom. They loathed him, yet feared him more than any enemy Rome had ever faced. For an enemy could be met with sword and shield. But how do you fight a god who kills with a quill? Each week, letters arrived from Capri, messages sealed in imperial wax, carried by trembling messengers who refused to meet anyone's eyes. The letters always began the same way. Tiberius Caesar Augustus to the Senate and people of Rome. But what followed could never be predicted. One scroll might contain praise, the next a list of names marked for death. The handwriting was neat, steady, almost tender. The same hand that once caressed a lover's face now condemned old friends to execution. No one could tell what provoked his wrath. A whisper in the marketplace, a private conversation overheard, even a gesture misinterpreted, all could be spun into treason. And the punishment was always final. The Senate's role became theater. They voted unanimously for whatever the emperor commanded. When his letters ordered a man's death, they thanked him for his vigilance. When he praised their loyalty, they wept with rehearsed gratitude. They wrote back in careful phrases, each word weighed like gold, terrified that sincerity itself might be considered rebellion. Outside the marble halls, the people of Rome learned the same lesson. Merchants, poets, even slaves, all lived under the emperor's invisible gaze. No rumor was safe. No jest about Capri could be told twice. Informers multiplied like insects, feeding on fear. A neighbor's silence might mean loyalty or deceit. In the dark corners of taverns, people spoke of the letters from the sea as if they were curses carried by the tide. And yet, Capri remained beautiful. Sailors who passed the island described white cliffs gleaming in sunlight, villas draped in ivy, the sea around it clear as glass. From a distance, it was paradise. But Rome knew what paradise concealed. The more serene Capri looked, the more monstrous its ruler seemed. The empire itself began to mirror its master. Governors bled their provinces dry. Generals executed rivals on suspicion alone. Corruption spread like a fever, each man taking from the next what mercy Tiberius had taken from him. Justice became a mockery. The empire that had conquered nations now devoured its own. In every statue of Augustus, people saw accusation, a reminder of what Rome once had been. The golden age was gone, replaced by the cold rain of fear. The Forum stood bright under the sun, but beneath its marble the heart of Rome was rotting. The people still cried, "Hail Caesar!" in the streets, but their voices lacked conviction. They had learned that worship was survival. True loyalty no longer existed, only submission. Mothers taught their children to speak softly, to look down when passing soldiers. Poets wrote verses praising the emperor's wisdom while burning their real words in the night. Rome had become a city of masks, each face smiling while the eyes begged for freedom. Yet, despite the terror, Tiberius ruled from afar with precision. His spies were everywhere. In the Senate, in the Praetorian Guard, in the homes of the nobility. Every conversation could find its way to Capri. Every whisper might echo back in a death sentence. Even the mighty Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, once Tiberius's most trusted ally, learned that loyalty offered no protection. When Sejanus grew too powerful, Tiberius destroyed him with a single letter. The Senate received the message, trembling as they read the order aloud. Sejanus was to be executed for treason. Within hours, the city erupted. His allies were dragged through the streets, their families slaughtered. The emperor did not return to witness it. He simply watched from his island, knowing that his hand could still command death from across the sea. That was the nature of his rule, distant, disembodied, divine. He did not need to shout or march or kill with his own sword. His power was colder than steel, quieter than poison. It lived in the minds of those who feared him. In the villas of the elite, wine poured, but no one dared drink freely. In the baths, laughter echoed, but eyes darted toward every stranger. And in the Senate, when his letters were read, the same phrase was repeated again and again. As the divine Tiberius commands, so it shall be. But even gods can be forgotten. The longer he stayed away, the more unreal he became. To the people, Tiberius was no longer a man but a legend, a ghost who ruled through paper and rumor. Yet his shadow was enough. Rome had conquered the world, but it could not conquer the darkness within its own throne. For in the heart of every citizen, a single truth festered like a wound. The emperor was not merely ruling from Capri, he was infecting the soul of Rome itself. The city had become his reflection, proud on the outside, hollow within. And though his body remained confined to that distant island, his madness had found a new empire to reign over, the minds of his people. By the final years of his reign, Capri had grown silent. The laughter, the music, even the whispers had faded. Only the sea still spoke, its endless voice rising from the cliffs, as if mocking the man who had tried to silence the world. Tiberius Caesar, once master of legions and law, now ruled over ghosts. Age had not softened him, it had only sharpened the edges of his fear. His face, once the image of Roman command, had collapsed into shadow, eyes sunken, lips drawn thin, skin pale as parchment. The emperor who had conquered empires could no longer conquer his own mind. He saw enemies everywhere. Servants who entered his chamber were searched for hidden daggers. Food tasters sampled each dish twice before he dared take a bite. He no longer slept soundly. When he did, it was in bursts, surrounded by guards whom he no longer trusted. He would wake suddenly, shouting at phantoms, convinced he heard footsteps in the dark. The sound of waves outside his villa became, to him, the whisper of conspirators plotting on the shore. Tiberius had once fled Rome to escape the poison of politics. But on Capri, he had bottled that poison within himself. Each year, his paranoia grew thicker, his mind darker. He began to hold secret councils with no one but his memories, pacing the marble floors, muttering names of those long dead. He accused the air of treason. He argued with the sea. He saw betrayal in every reflection, even in his own. Servants reported that he had covered the mirrors in his chamber, unable to face the ghostly figure that stared back. At times, he claimed it was not his image at all, but that of a demon wearing his face. In those moments, he would order torches brought, burning incense to cleanse the room, as though fire could drive out the monster within. The pleasures that had once filled his days now disgusted him. The games, the feasts, the performances, all turned hollow. What had once been indulgence became torment. His mind was devouring itself. What once thrilled now revolted. What once gave him power now reminded him of decay. He realized, perhaps too late, that desire can only consume, never satisfy. But power, control, those he could not release. To command was his final obsession. He began to issue decrees no one could understand. Promotions for the dead, executions for the innocent, rewards for those who had never existed. He sent contradictory orders to Rome, laughing when the Senate obeyed them both. For Tiberius, chaos itself had become proof of his divinity. And yet, within that chaos, a new figure emerged, a young man whose eyes gleamed with the same hunger the emperor once had, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The world would come to know him by another name, Caligula. Tiberius had taken the boy into his care years earlier, out of a sense of duty, or perhaps curiosity. Caligula, the son of the beloved Germanicus, was both heir and threat. But Tiberius saw something in him, something familiar. The quiet cunning, the fascination with power, the smile that never reached the eyes. He made the young man his shadow, teaching him the art of deception, the performance of mercy, the joy of control. Caligula watched and learned. He learned how fear could command loyalty, how silence could shape obedience. He learned that cruelty, when delivered with calm, becomes divine. In the flickering torchlight of Villa Jovis, the old emperor looked upon his protege and saw not a successor, but a reflection, a younger, more dangerous version of himself. Perhaps he understood then that his corruption would not die with him. It would live on in the boy's smile. Capri had birthed not one monster, but two. Tiberius began to withdraw completely, speaking to no one for days. He refused to see senators or envoys. The empire ran on rumor. His orders grew stranger. He demanded that sacrifices be made in his name, that astrologers chart his immortality, that every mention of his illness be punished by death. The man who had once commanded the world now demanded worship from the silence. But nature is not loyal to tyrants. His body, weakened by age and excess, began to fail him. Fever consumed him. His hands trembled. His breath grew shallow. He was surrounded by servants who prayed he would die, and courtiers who feared he never would. Even Caligula, who once smiled in his presence, now waited in secret impatience. The student had outgrown the master. Tiberius sensed it. He could feel betrayal gathering around him like a storm, and so, even on his deathbed, he plotted. He ordered guards to remain armed at all hours, forbade Caligula from leaving the villa, and whispered his final decrees to those too terrified to question them. But power, once absolute, cannot survive decay. It slips through the fingers like water, no matter how tightly it is grasped. The historians would later disagree on how he died. Some said he passed quietly in his sleep, others that Caligula hastened the process, smothering the dying emperor beneath his own blankets. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between, that Tiberius's death was less an act of murder than mercy, an end to the suffering of a man who had long ceased to live. When word reached Rome, the people celebrated in the streets. Statues were toppled, prisoners released. The Senate offered prayers of thanksgiving to the gods. The empire exhaled for the first time in decades. But on Capri, the sea remained unchanged. It did not mourn, nor did it rejoice. It simply continued, endless and indifferent, as it had when Tiberius arrived, as it would long after his bones turned to dust. Caligula ascended the throne, hailed as a savior. Yet behind his smile lingered the shadow of Capri, the lessons learned in the villa of nightmares. Tiberius's madness had not died, it had only changed form. The monster had devoured himself, but his hunger lived on in the blood of his heir. There was a cruel symmetry in it all. The man who had sought to become a god had ended as less than human. In chasing immortality, he ensured only infamy. The empire he ruled would remember his name not for victory, but for corruption, not for glory, but for decay. And so the story closed as it began, with an emperor alone, staring into the sea. At dawn, the sky over Capri burned gold. The waves shimmered like molten glass beneath the cliffs of Villa Jovis. The emperor stood at his window, frail and trembling, the wind tugging at his robes. He gazed upon the water that had kept him prisoner and God alike, and for the first time, he saw the truth. The reflection that stared back was not human. History does not remember Tiberius as a man, it remembers him as a mirror, a reflection of what power can do when no one dares to say no. Was he born cruel, or did Rome create him? Perhaps both. The same empire that demanded gods of its rulers also stripped them of their humanity. From the moment Tiberius was chosen as heir, his life ceased to be his own. Every gesture was a performance, every decision a test of loyalty. Love was forbidden, trust was dangerous, and weakness was death. In such a world, even the strongest mind begins to fracture. The Senate called him divine, the people called him distant. But behind the marble mask there was only a man, aging, haunted, consumed by the very system that crowned him. Rome built him to be a god, and then abandoned him when he became too monstrous to worship. When the end came, there were no trumpets, no processions. The emperor who had ruled the known world died in silence. No family gathered, no prayers were offered. The sea outside his villa was the only witness, calm, endless, and indifferent. The man who had once commanded millions left behind nothing but fear, and a name that history would whisper like a curse. And yet, his story endures. Because in every age, in every throne room, there are those who believe themselves untouchable, who mistake authority for divinity, who think power can silence the human soul. Tiberius was not the first, nor the last. He is a warning written in stone and shadow, that no empire, no matter how mighty, can protect its rulers from themselves. He ruled the greatest empire on earth, yet died surrounded by silence and shadows, because even an emperor cannot escape the empire of his own mind.